All right, folks, I'm about to get started here. Welcome back, everybody. Welcome back to the fourth week together. This is the fourth time we're meeting together. If you can believe that, things are getting serious now. We're deep into the semester, so hopefully all of you have made that transition mentally of accepting your reality, accepting your fate, and just embracing it, and hopefully that will lead to good results. As far as this class goes, we have an exam coming up in 2 weeks. So 2 weeks from today, there will be an exam. So just keep that in mind. We're going to cover today the remainder of Chapter 7 that we started on last time. And then we'll cover some of Chapter 8. Then we'll finish Chapter 8 and Chapter 9 next week. And then that'll be the end of the first section of the course. Again, I have a practice exam available for you online. That's been there since the second week actually, and it gives you an idea of how you're going to be tested and how you should be thinking about this stuff. So check that out. Go through the lectures. Go through everything I cover in my lectures. Again, it's about mastering the tools and understanding the language of economics, and so that's what I'm going to expect from you. Yes. No. It's going to be an in-class written exam. No. It's a PDF. It's on Moodle. Okay. Yeah, so it's available there already. It's been there, and check it out when you get a chance. And there's an answer key and a blank exam. I would suggest maybe waiting until we're done covering the material next week, and then maybe taking the exam yourself, seeing where you stand, figuring out what you need to work on, and working on it. Again, this class is about repetition. You're learning a lot of new concepts that are foreign to you. And so whenever you're going to learn that kind of stuff, well, you need to go through it several times. Definitely don't leave anything till the last moment. That is a terrible idea. And again, you want to make sure that as we're moving along, you understand everything that we're covering. So if I'm covering something in class and you feel it's a little fast, go home, go over it again until you get it. You may not know it at that point, but you got it to the point where right before the exam, you can just recall what you already understand rather than sit there trying to figure new stuff out for the first time right before an exam. That's, again, recipe for disaster. So avoid that. But again, we do have 2 weeks. It's not super, super pressing, but it is coming. And so you need to be aware of it. Keep it in the back of your mind. Every moment between now and then is an opportunity, not just for this class, but all your classes. As you know, when midterms start to pile up, time becomes very scarce. So if you're not at that point yet where, it's tight and you only have so much time to devote to things, and this is the time to be really taking advantage of that time that you have and using it to do everything you can to be prepared for those times when the time crunch occurs. So that means not going out with your friends. That means not playing video games. That means doing the things that you are least likely to do on your own first. And then if you have some time, spend it enjoyably with whomever or doing whatever that is enjoyable to you. You have a right to do that, of course. But again, as you get older, and you become more of independent people, it's the key to success is how well you manage your time, how well you are able to say, even at times where you can just kind of go crazy and have a good time and forget all responsibility, at those times say, no, it's time for me to buckle down and take care of A, B, C, D, make sure all these things are done so that, my present and my future are on stable footing. And then, if there's extra time, you decide, okay, now it's time for me to enjoy my time. And of course, these things aren't mutually exclusive. It doesn't mean that if you devote all your time to the things that matter to being successful in life, that you will never again have fun. That's not how it works. But in life, there's ups and downs, and definitely when you're in school, there are severe peaks with respect to how many things you have to take care of in order to advance in your lives. And so again, we are close to one of those moments now. We're not quite at that peak yet. About 2 weeks, we'll be there. So this is the time to kind of just realize where you're at and take every moment you have to make the next few weeks not as hard on you as they will ultimately be. So do your best. Do your best to make that happen. And things will work out better than you think. All right, so as far as this class goes, like I said, we're going to continue on with chapter 7 today. We're going to do a good review of the stuff we already covered last week, because this is like foundational, super important stuff that will be relevant for the entire semester. And so I want to just make sure that I cover it thoroughly enough where, I can continue to reference it on a regular basis, and you'll have a good idea of what I'm talking about. So we'll be covering most of chapter 7 once again today, and then, of course, to the end. So again, chapter 7 deals with GDP and the CPI, ways of tracking the economy. So GDP is gross domestic product. It's how we measure the total output of the economy. It's one of the metrics, one of the measures that we use to gauge like the health of the economy. How well is the economy operating? Well, let's look at the output of the economy. So again, we started talking about how like there's different ways of measuring that, and like how the circular flow diagram sort of gives us some insights into that. So we'll cover that once again. And then we'll talk about this measure in terms of what's called real terms. So in any economy, you have overall rising prices in the economy. And because you have overall rising prices in the economy, that can sort of throw off this like these measures that you use of output in the economy, because prices are going up. So if prices are going up and you're not increasing the amount you're producing, but if you're measuring the output of the economy by the value of what's produced, and prices are just going up in general, then it's going to give you the wrong idea that the economy is growing, where in truth it's just prices are going up. And so then we adjust for that. And so then we have a measure called real GDP, which we'll talk about again today. And in order to get that measure of real GDP, we need a measure of like the price level. And how we do that is what's called the Consumer Price Index. And we'll talk about what this index is and how it's measured and what it means, and we'll have a couple of examples on how the numbers work. So again, we'll cover the national accounts, which is the ways in which that we measure output in the economy, which gives us our measure of GDP. And then we'll look at the adjusted measure of GDP that gives us a more realistic view of what it is that the economy is actually doing, independent of changes in prices. Then we'll talk about price indexes and the aggregate price level, again, the CPI. And then finally, we'll get into Chapter 8. And Chapter 8 deals with the other metric that we use to sort of gauge the overall functioning of the economy, which is like the level of unemployment in the economy. And so we'll talk about like how that's measured, the different types of unemployment. So basically, all the nuances, the little working parts of unemployment that allow us to say, well, this measure is what we can say can give us an idea of how the economy is doing, independent of like some other aspects of the economy that are related to employment that maybe are somewhat misleading. So these issues are somewhat complicated, and that's what these chapters are about. They're about kind of like fleshing out the complications and then giving us a relatively concrete idea of like about the actual final concept that we wind up using to track the economy. And then also in this chapter we talk about inflation, which is again like the rate at which prices are either going up or down. Inflation is the rate at which prices are going up in the economy, and then you can have deflation, which is the rate at which they're going down. We'll talk about all the issues related to that, how you measure it, the effects that it has in the economy, the causes of it, but that section will likely hold off till next week. So we'll get through the end of chapter 7, and then we'll go. I'd ideally like to cover all of unemployment today as well. in Chapter 8. So that's my target. Hopefully we'll cover all of it today. And again, we'll talk about the unemployment rate, that number you always hear about in the news. The unemployment rate is this, that, and the other. We'll talk about what that means. We'll talk about this other measure called the natural rate of unemployment. And I'll talk about what that means when we get to it. And then eventually inflation and deflation. And again, for those of you that came late, we have an exam in 2 weeks. So we'll finish Chapter 8 next week, and then we'll cover Chapter 9, and that'll be all the material that will be covered on the first exam. Chapters 1 through 3, and then chapters 6 through 9. Any questions about anything not related to the actual material? Yeah. Yes, I will provide the exams. You will need a green Scantron. Next week I'll email about which one it is. It's like, I think it's 882-E or something. It's that skinny green one. And you'll need a calculator. Phones will not be allowed because phones are not phones. They are computers that are very powerful. You can house entire textbooks. So phones will not be allowed. Graphing calculators will not be allowed either because graphing calculators can save data as well. And so you'll need just a regular calculator for the exam. Was there a question back there? Well, I posted a practice exam. Yeah. So that's on Moodle already. It's been there since the second week. I emailed you guys about it, so it's there and you can check it out. And again, there's a blank version without answers, and then there's an answer key. And so my suggestion would be just to gloss over it right now, just to get an idea of what you're in store for. What you're in store for as far as the structure is like 15 multiple choice and 4 open answer with multiple parts that you have to do maybe some computations, fill in some stuff. That's what you're in store for. Maybe just check it out just to get an idea of what it's going to look like. But wait until after we cover all the material next Tuesday, and then maybe take the exam. If you can, set up those conditions for yourself. Like sit down, take the exam. We're going to have half the class to take it, and so try to maybe set up those same conditions for yourself. See where you stand, and then go from there. See what you need to work on, and it should be a good gauge. Other questions? Yeah. Well, it's not a programmed exam. It's just a PDF. Yeah. So you just print it out, and there is an answer key. There's a blank PDF, and there's an answer key PDF as well. On Moodle, been there since week 2, available for your viewing pleasure at any time. Other questions? Again, this is in 2 weeks. So if you have questions about the exam, bring them up to me next week. And I'll also send out an email next week telling you exactly what you need for the exam, and that's that. Also, just keep in mind also that since we meet once a week, that these one meetings are basically encompass a week's worth of lecture, and so therefore on the day of the exam we will have a lecture after the exam. So it's just I can't blow an entire essentially day of class by not having that, so I have to have that. So we will have the exam, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll come back and continue with the class. So just keep that in mind. I don't love it either, but it's just the nature of these classes I meet once a week. Yes? Yeah, about an hour and 5 minutes to take the exam. I'll have a clock running down the time, and when the time's over, that's when it's time to turn the exams in. It's like you would take an exam in a normal class. It's an hour and 10 minutes. So sorry, folks. That's the best I can do. I have to teach the material throughout the rest of that day, or else I'll get behind in the class. So. Other questions? Yeah. Of course. Yeah, of course. Other questions? I mean, it just depends, But it depends on how well everybody's doing as far as studying, as far as understanding the material. But traditionally, these courses do tend to be relatively challenging to people, and so there's usually a curve in courses like this. And so There will likely be a curve. In fact, there will most certainly be a curve, and the curve will help people. And in the end, like I mentioned the first day, like I'm gonna, like most people will pass the course, but if you want a good grade in the class, you have to earn that. And whenever there's a curve, there's winners and there's losers. So people will wind up at the bottom. So if people start to get too comfortable with the curves and then think they can just skate by doing the absolute minimum, then that's a dangerous road to walk, because you can wind up failing the course. And so that's just something to keep in mind. But to those people that normally try hard in courses in general, because you are driven people, because you want to succeed at everything you do, then the curves wind up helping you a lot and making the experience overall very comfortable for you. And so just overall, just try your best. That's all that ultimately matters here. Just do your absolute best, and things should work out for you. Yes. Yeah, like there's going to be multiple choice, so they'll be similar to that. And then some of the stuff I cover in class, like the problems and some of the stuff, everything that I cover in lecture that is like terminology or application, like that's fair game. Like a lot of the stuff that I mention in my lectures is like me reading a lot of the textbook to you, and that's just meant to sort of just give you like an idea of the language, what it means, like give you more insight into these concepts. But if you look at the exam, you see exactly what I'm expecting as far as like what you should be knowing and what I'm going to test you on. So that's why I posted it early. I was hoping that people would check it out early so you can get an idea of like how you should be thinking about the material. If that hasn't happened yet, it's fine. We still have 2 weeks. Check it out and adjust your behavior accordingly. Yes. No, it'll be on Sunday. Yeah. Yeah. The Tuesday was because of the ad drop stuff, and yeah. So now from this point forward, everything will be as normal as the syllabus would imply. Anything else? Yeah. It might say that. If it does, just ignore it. Like the just look at the syllabus in terms of like what you should be doing if you're afraid of that. But there should be nothing. Just any homework assignment that's going to be due will be due because we finished a chapter. And so as soon as we're done with the chapter, I'll open up the homework for that chapter, and that's what's going to be due. So we finished 1 through 3 and 6 so far. So those are the homeworks that I expected you to have done by now. And then 7 we'll finish today, so I'll open that to be completed by Sunday night. Anything else? All right. All right, then let us move forward. Again, this is like one of the last 2 sections before the exam, so it's time to like really like try to absorb all this stuff as much as possible, please. I want you all to do well. I want you to do extremely well. I don't want there to be a curve, and that would mean that everybody earns A's and B's without a curve, and that would make me so happy. But we'll see what happens. And obviously, there's like half of you are here. Some of the people that aren't here are on top of things, so don't assume that everybody that's not here is just a slacker, because they're not. But some of them are. So the fact that you are here, it reflects strongly upon you. It says that you are committed to doing well. Like it is an option for you to be here. You don't have to be here, but you are choosing to be here. That says a lot. Now, hopefully that's not all that's going on with you. Hopefully there's something more to that. You're not just driven to come to class, but to succeed at what you're doing. And so you are spending the time at home to get this stuff down, reading the book, paying attention to the homework problems, going back through the lectures, making sure you got everything. Hopefully that is what's happening. So if that is indeed what is happening, I'm sure that is what's happening with some of you, then just keep that up and things are going to work out. Things are going to work out regardless, folks. Just try hard. That's all I need. Try hard. All right, let us move forward. So previously in Econ 161, we started on this chapter, GDP and the CPI tracking the macroeconomy. So again, this class is about the overall ups and downs of the economy. In chapter 6, we got an introduction into like the main topics that we're going to be covering in the class. So that chapter was more about like understanding like the language of like macro topics, and there was some application stuff in there. Just check it out again. Make sure you have all that stuff down because it is sort of a preview of everything that's to come. And everything that we touched upon will be fleshed out throughout the remainder of the semester. So make sure you have that stuff down. But before that, we did cover like 3 chapters. The first one was about like just basic principles that underlie economic theory, and that chapter has a lot of important terminology in it as well. And again, it's about sort of setting the foundation for like a very particular perspective on life, which is the economic way of thinking, which if you understand that chapter, it will help you understand a lot of what we do going forward. And then we went on to chapter 2, which had to do with the introduction of models. So again, in economics, like we simplify the world as much as possible in order to then like kind of zero in on whatever it is we're interested in studying. And we use models for that. And that's where the simplification comes into play. We hold things constant in order to then zero in on, like with the comparative advantage model, the benefits of trade. So with the comparative advantage model, we looked at the production possibility frontiers of 2 different countries, and we looked at in a world in which only 2 goods were being produced, and in order to establish whether or not a country had a comparative advantage, we had to look at who had the highest opportunity cost. So whoever had the lowest opportunity cost had a comparative advantage in producing something, and whoever had the highest opportunity cost in doing that activity did not have a comparative advantage. So the country that had the comparative advantage wound up being the one that would produce the thing they had a comparative advantage in. And then what that model established for us was that there are gains from trade, which is one of the principles that we covered in the first chapter. So by specializing in the thing, you have the best comparative advantage in, meaning you have the lowest cost in, and in economics, costs are just opportunity costs. Then every individual that does specialize will help to collectively produce more. And so if we focus on the things that we're best at, everybody can benefit a lot more, is basically the insight that model gave us. It's a simple model, but it was created in like the 1800s, and it provided insights that we had not really understood clearly before, so it's powerful. So it's definitely worth understanding. But again, that chapter was more about like understanding the fact that economists use models as tools. That's basically what we do. And so we will be using models throughout the semester. Some of them will be more complicated than others. So the next model that we looked at, which is the staple of economic theory, was the one that we covered in chapter 3, which was the demand and supply model. Last week we went through a couple of examples on what it means for a demand and supply model to be in equilibrium, and how that equilibrium can change with respect to changes in either side of the market, either demand or supply. So again, that's another example of a very powerful model that economists use to understand markets. And even though it seemed like ultimately a very micro sort of centric topic, there are all sorts of markets that we can look at, and some of those markets will be relevant to the macroeconomy. And so it is worth your time to understand that model as well, not just for the sake of passing the next exam, but also for understanding some of the later market models that we will introduce that will help give us more insights into the overall functioning of the economy. So that's what we did so far. It's been sort of more of like introducing the discipline and what our tools are and like our way of thinking. And then we jumped last week into chapter 6, which was like, okay, here's a preview of what's to come as far as like macro topics. And then we started on this chapter, which is very much about like providing us like the important insights into like the big measures that we use to track the economy. The next chapter is also about that. So these couple of chapters are about like tools, metrics, ways of measuring the economy that help us to understand the economy. And then we'll actually be throwing this stuff together into models post the first exam. So the models will get relatively complicated. So just something to keep in mind. All right, so let's talk about this metric once again, GDP, which has to do with tracking output in the economy. So the national income and product accounts, or the national accounts, keep track of the flows of money between different sectors of the economy. And it's calculated by the Bureau of Economic Analysis, just one of the various bureaus in our federal government that helps to sort of keep track of the economy. So this is a division of the U.S. government's Department of Commerce. In Chapter 2, we introduced a basic circular flow model in which we established that there is a flow of money that goes in one direction in the economy, and there's a flow of goods and services that goes in the opposite direction of the economy. And in that very simplified model, we had households, which are, of course, just like either individuals or several individuals that either consume and therefore buy goods and services in the market for goods and services, or they sell their factors of production. So the things that firms need to produce, households also sell in those markets. So they're buyers and they're sellers. And then, of course, you've got firms who sell goods and services in the market for goods and services, and then buy the factors of production from the factor markets. All right, so again, this is like sort of the simple starting point for the circular flow diagram that began to give us some insights into the nature of overall output in the economy, and it helps us to understand the three different ways in which we can measure the gross domestic product, the output of the economy. So remember, households spend money in markets for goods and services, and that's what we call consumer spending. So that's household spending on goods and services. That's going to be one of the main components of spending in the economy that we will always be looking at in this course, so consumer spending. Now, another agent in this world, a series of folks that make decisions in the economy, is the rest of the world. That's something that was not introduced in the original simple circular flow model in Chapter 2, but it was introduced in this model in order to then open up the economy. So an open economy is an economy that trades with the rest of the world, and so that obviously today is is the reality for most countries. And so if you're going to study the economy, you need to understand a domestic economy in relation to the rest of the world. And so you can't really understand the macroeconomy without including the rest of the world in there. And so that's why we introduced it into this model that we had already started looking at. So the rest of the world also buys goods and services from us, from the market for goods and services that our firms sell goods in. Now, the households also own factors of production and sell these factors of production to receive what's called the factor prices. So we've got wages they receive for the labor. We've got profits that they receive for the excess ownership above just like the costs that firms incur to produce. They have income streams that households own a claim on via stock ownership, and so in the factor markets, the households are then paid through those markets the profits from the firms. So the other thing they also get is interest from the firms. So firms need to borrow money from households. So they'll issue bonds, which are basically promises to pay back. So if you buy a bond from somebody, you are lending them money. So governments issue bonds and firms issue bonds. So you could have public bonds or private bonds. I mentioned last week, like with the whole high-speed train that they're trying to build in California, like one of the approaches they're trying to use to generate the money they need to establish this train is to sell a bunch of bonds, which means that everybody, whoever's interested buys the bonds. They're guaranteed some sort of return on those bonds. The government uses the money to build the train, and then they have to pay back, obviously, these loans, these bonds, and they will ultimately do so with the revenue they gain from the operating of the trains. But firms also, like let's say they have like a big research and development project that they want to fund, and so one way to generate money for that is they'll issue a bunch of bonds, and then the bonds can be bought and sold on the open market as well. So in securities markets, you'll see bonds in there as well, both private and public bonds, and you'll see bonds going back to like the Napoleonic Wars, even earlier, because some bonds are they never end. Like they always perpetually pay out an interest rate. They're called consols. So you have all sorts of different bonds that have different maturity dates, is what it's called. And some of these maturity dates are infinite. And so there's all sorts of different assets that are bought and sold. Again, we're talking about income that comes from firms to households. So one way that income can go to households is interest on these bonds. So that's where the interest is coming from. And then finally, you've got rent. And rent is the price of the productive resources that households own. So this just indirectly implies that homes are renting out this equipment to firms, and then firms are obviously paying a rent for them. We'll keep it simple and say that is the case, but there is a more complicated way of establishing what this rent is, and we'll cover it later on in the course. So again, this money goes to the households in exchange for the households selling their factors of production to firms in the factor market. So you've got this big set of markets that exist. You've got this set of markets that exist. All right. Again, stock is a share in the ownership of a company held by a shareholder, which is what generates the profits to households. And bonds are the ways that firms pay interest to households. All right. Now, households don't get to keep all the income they receive via the factor market. So in the original simple circular flow diagram in Chapter 2, we didn't include the government. So obviously, there are governments, and governments tax and spend. So we need to incorporate that in this more complicated circular flow diagram in order to reflect the macroeconomy in a more accurate way. And so we'll throw the government in. The government is going to play several roles in the economy, or play several roles in the economy. They spend, they borrow, and so let's start making those connections here. So again, we have taxes that are paid out from the wages, profit, and interest and rent that households make. So part of that goes to the government in the form of taxes. And then governments pay households sometimes money in the form of like Social Security or unemployment or welfare checks or any sort of like payment that the government makes to a household. That is what's called a government transfer. And so that's going to play a role throughout the course. So just keep that term in mind. So government transfers, again, are payments by the government to individuals for which no good or service is provided in return. Taking taxes and government transfers into consideration, we can then define like the actual income that we're interested in this class, which is called disposable income. So disposable income is the income that households gain from the factor markets, net of taxes and government transfers. So households get wages, profit, interest, and rent. They pay some of those taxes to the government, and then they get some money back in the form of government transfers. So whatever's left over after that, that's the disposable income, and that's what's left to either consume and therefore buy stuff from the goods, from the market for goods and services, or to save. So that's another avenue that the disposable income might wind up. Yes. Incorporates net income. You're okay. Sure. All right, so households don't normally spend all their disposable income on goods and services, like I mentioned before. So some of it is channeled into private savings. So private savings equals disposable income minus consumer spending, and it's disposable income that is not spent on consumption. And having introduced the concept of private savings, we can then throw in this other set of markets that are key in an economy. So an economy is made up of markets. So just what you're seeing here, the fact that there are markets, that is what, by definition, is creating this economy. So we've got these three markets, which are basically the heart of a major sovereign nation's economy. So financial markets are that third key market, and that's where household savings go. So financial markets include the banking, stock, and bond markets, which channel private savings and foreign lending into investment spending, government borrowing, and foreign borrowing. So again, part of the disposable income is channeled in the form of private savings to these financial markets. The rest of the world also puts money into these financial markets. So they'll lend to us domestically, and they'll purchase stocks and bonds from these financial markets as well. So households buy stocks and bonds in financial markets as well via the private savings. The government borrows from households and the rest of the world inside of these financial markets. And foreign firms, foreign governments also borrow from us domestically in these financial markets. So foreign firms or governments might buy stocks from us, or they might buy our bonds. So you hear about China and having all this U.S. debt. Well, they're buying up a bunch of our bonds, and that means that we're borrowing money from them. And then firms also borrow money by selling stocks and also issuing bonds in these financial markets. So the arrows show us the direction in which the money is going. So in this case, the firms are, again, borrowing money from households and from the rest of the world. All right, so the government uses its revenues and borrowed funds to buy goods and services. So again, it borrows money here and it gains revenue from taxes. And with those two sources of income, then it is able to buy goods and services as well. So a lot of the infrastructure projects that the government takes on is considered spending of goods on goods and services. Anything that the government spends money on that is an exchange of money for something is considered a purchase of a good or service by the government. Now, the rest of the world participates in the U.S. economy in three different ways. So some of the goods and services produced in the United States are sold to residents of other countries, right? So residents of other countries buy our goods. That means we are exporting goods to them. So when they are buying our goods, we are selling them our exports, goods and services sold to other countries. Some of the goods and services purchased by the residents of the United States are produced abroad, though. So the rest of the world also obviously has its own set of firms, and they produce products which we buy from them. And so that is the opposite direction in terms of the money flow and the goods flow. So we pay the rest of the world for their goods, and thus we are buying imports from them. So again, imports are goods and services purchased from other countries. And then, of course, the third way that the rest of the world is connected to our domestic economy is through foreign borrowing and lending. And that happens over here. So again, like they buy some of our stocks, they buy some of our bonds, they put money into our financial markets, but they also sell us bonds and stocks as well. All right, so firms also buy goods and services in this expanded view of the economy. So we know that firms produce goods and services, but as I mentioned last time, some firms are buying stuff from other firms, right? So like you've got a car manufacturer who's putting together like a final car that we all buy at, car lots, but they have to buy maybe some of the parts for the car from other buyers, from other producers. So they have like other companies that maybe produce the engines and the wheels or whatever. So another thing that we have to take into consideration with respect to the firm spending, which is what we term investment spending, is that there are also inventories that can build up in warehouses with respect to what's being produced. So at any given period of time, all the firms in an economy will produce a certain amount of goods. The economy may be kind of slow during that time, and so they won't buy all the goods and services that are produced in that period. And so some of those goods and services will just go into warehouses as inventory, and that's considered investment spending on the part of firms. So inventories are stocks of goods and raw materials held to facilitate business operations. And again, it's a component of investment spending. So here again, we have this new arrow, investment spending, where firms are buying goods and services in the markets for goods and services, and we term that type of spending investment spending. So we've got investment spending on the part of firms, consumer spending on the part of households, government purchases of goods and services on the part of the government, and then of course we have the purchases of goods from the rest of the world, and they buy goods from us. So that's all the spending that goes on in the economy. As far as the investment spending by firms, it's spending on productive physical capital such as machinery and construction of buildings, and on changes to inventories. So the national accounts count this investment spending as part of total spending on goods and services. So the inventory spending is part of that spending. And so overall, the investment spending is calculated as part of the total spending that occurs in the economy. Changes to inventories of finished goods and services are counted as investment spending because, like machinery, they change the ability of a firm to make future sales. Now, I'm going through all of this in fine detail again because everything that I'm saying here is going to play just a key role in your understanding of everything we're going to do from this point forward. So even this mentioning of the inventories and that being part of investment spending, that's going to play a big role in this big model that we're going to look at post the first exam, called the Keynesian cross model. And so in order to understand that model, you have to understand this concept. So just keep in mind that everything that's being mentioned is important. It's not just like going through stuff for the sake of getting through chapters. This is foundational stuff, folks. All right, so changes to inventories of finished goods are counted as investment spending because, like machinery, they change the ability of a firm to make future sales. So a drawing down of inventories, so let's say you're in a period where the economy has heated up, and so the amount of spending that occurs is greater than what firms projected as far as like what they produce. So therefore, they need to dip into their inventories in order to satisfy demand. So the drawing down of inventories is counted as a fall in investment spending because it leads to lower future sales. Investment spending includes spending on construction of any structure, regardless of whether it's an assembly plant or a new house. Like a plant, a new house produces a future stream of output, housing services for its occupants. So that is why building a house also is included in the category of investment spending. So again, adding up consumer spending by households on goods and services, investment spending by firms, government purchases of goods and services by the government, and then adding the value of exports and subtracting the value of imports, that will give us a measure of the overall value of the goods and services that the economy produces. And that is what we call the gross domestic product. Now, as I mentioned last time, there's 3 ways of measuring gross domestic product, and the circular flow diagram basically captured all of that. So in one way to understand one of the ways of measuring it is to understand the concept of final goods and services versus intermediate goods and services. So final goods and services are goods and services sold to the final or end user, like the car being sold by a car manufacturer to us. Intermediate goods and services are goods and services bought from one firm by another firm, and those are generally inputs for the production of final goods and services. And so then one way of measuring gross domestic product, our GDP, is to look at the market value of all final goods and services that are produced within an economy. So adding up the total value of final goods and services produced isn't the only way of calculating GDP. Since GDP is equal to the total value of final goods and services produced in the economy, it must also equal the flow of funds received by firms from sales in the goods and services market. So the other way of measuring the GDP is not just to look at the value of what's produced, but also the amount of spending that occurs in the economy of what's produced. And so then that is also a way of calculating our gross domestic product, the total output of the economy. So the total amount of spending that occurs in the economy is called aggregate spending. It is the sum of consumer spending, investment spending, government purchases of goods and services, and exports minus imports. So remember, exports, we're selling to the rest of the world, and so we're getting money for that. So that is part of aggregate spending. But we're also spending on goods coming from the rest of the world, the imports. And so that's money that's going out of our country, right? So we subtract that from our aggregate spending. So a second way of calculating GDP is to add up aggregate spending on domestically produced final goods and services in the economy. And finally, a third way of calculating GDP is to sum the total factor income earned by households from firms in the economy. So one of the principles that we learned in the first chapter was that all spending is somebody's income. And so if we're gonna measure the amount of output in the economy as the amount that's spent on that output in the economy, then the amount that is spent in the economy must also be equal to the income that is paid out by firms to households in the form of profit, wages, interest, and rent. So again, $10 for a shave, a barber's income of $10 equals consumer spending of $10. So again, GDP can be calculated 3 ways. One is to add up the total value of final goods and services produced. The other is to add up all spending, aggregate spending, on domestically produced final goods and services. And then the third is to add up the total factor income earned by households from firms in the economy. Finally, we can start on today's lecture. Well, we covered all this stuff last time, but it's so important. I had to go through it one more time, or else this would have all been a disaster. And now you're going to see why. So we're going to do an example of calculating GDP. So we're going to consider a hypothetical economy that consists of only 3 firms that produce some goods in the economy. We've got American Motors, Inc., this company here. It produces 1 car per year. So that is the total output of final goods and services in this economy. Then we have American Steel, Inc. It produces the steel that goes into the car. That's this firm here. And then we have American Ore, Inc. that mines the iron ore that goes into the steel. So steel was actually one of the big advances that helped us to sort of advance to the level that we're at now, that modern economic growth has allowed for, which has changed our world, as I've mentioned before, allowed us to have this crazy standard of living that we have now versus what we had like 100 years ago. This just innovation in like figuring out, if we take iron ore, basic iron that's mined from the earth, and we like ingest like oxygen into in this weird process, then we can make this even stronger steel that then allowed us to, create all sorts of things, including like steam engines and high rises and a lot of our infrastructure that represents the modern world. Anyway, so American Ore, that's the third company. All right, so in this economy, the GDP is only $21,500, and it's the value of one car per year that the economy produces. So that's one of the approaches to measuring the GDP. It's the value of final goods and services produced in an economy. In this case, it's a simple economy. Only a car is being produced throughout the entire year. And so the GDP can be measured as just the value of that one car. So again, there's the first approach, measuring GDP is the value of production of final goods and services. So counting the full value of each producer's sales, if we were to look at all of their sales, would cause us to count the same items several times and artificially inflate the calculation of GDP. So the car manufacturer who makes final goods and services uses intermediate goods that are bought from these other firms to create the car. But if we were to count their sales to American Motors, then we would be double counting some things, and therefore we would be, again, overinflating the value of everything that's produced in the economy. So in this case, the American Ore Company that just mines the iron sells $4,200 worth of iron ore. The American Steel Company sells $9,000 worth of steel, and the American Motor Company sells $21,500 worth of a car in one car. So adding all those three together gives us a value of all sales of intermediate and final goods and services to be $34,700. And GDP is only $21,500. And so we have a method of like counting out these double counts in order to avoid overinflating our GDP. So the way we avoid double counting is to count only each producer's value added in the calculation of GDP. So value added is the value of a firm's sales minus the value of its purchases of intermediate goods. So this value added approach is what allows us to have an accurate measure of GDP when we are measuring GDP as the value of final goods and services produced in the economy. So American Ore Company, the value of its sales is $4,200. So its value added is $4,200. It didn't pay anyone for intermediate goods, and so its value added is $4,200. American Steel Inc. bought $4,200 worth of iron from American Ore Inc. And so it bought intermediate goods in order to produce its steel, which it sold for $9,000. So therefore, its value added is going to be the value of what it sold minus the amount it spent on intermediate goods. And so its value added is $4,800. And then finally, you've got the producer of the final good and service that is produced in the economy, the car. The car requires steel. And so the American Motor Inc. company bought $9,000 worth of steel from the American Steel Company. Gesundheit. And then it created a car and it sold it for $21,500. And so therefore, its value added is the difference between $21,500 and what it spent on intermediate goods and services, the steel. And so its value added is $12,500. And so therefore, the value added approach allows us to get to the value of GDP that doesn't double count anything. And again, it's going to be equal to $21,500. So the value of production of final goods and service is equal to the sum of value added. All right. Now, we can also measure GDP as spending on domestically final goods and produced final goods and services. So this measurement must be carried out in the way that avoids double counting. We don't want to count both consumer spending on the car and the auto producer spending on steel. If we counted both, we'd be counting the steel embodied in the car. So the problem is solved by counting only the value of sales to final buyers, such as consumers, firms that purchase investment goods, the government, or foreign buyers. So we omit sales of inputs from one business to one another when estimating GDP using spending data. So again, we're only looking at the purchase of final goods and services by final buyers. So this would take into account the goods and services that American Motor Inc. maybe bought from other firms. That would be part of investment spending. So we have the government that's also going to play a role, consumers, and foreign buyers, which is like the difference between imports and exports. So all those forms of spending that we identified in the circular flow diagram will make up the aggregate spending. And in this case, it's going to be equal to 21,500. All right, so the national accounts do include investment spending by firms as part of final spending. So an auto company's purchase of steel to make a car isn't considered part of final spending, but the company's purchase of new machinery for its factory is considered part of final spending. So it can get sort of technical. I'm not going to expect you to know it like precisely, but definitely like the big ideas and like the computations, like I'm going to expect you to understand that and understand why we do the things that we do and why ultimately the three approaches are equivalent. Since purchases of capital goods that firms make to produce, so again, they buy machines, they buy buildings that will last for a considerable time, aren't closely related to current production, then the national accounts consider such purchases a form of final sale. So to really like get like very specific about what is included and what is not, it takes a while because there's a lot of sort of caveats in there. If you ever have a lot of time in your hands, check it out. The BEA is available with all this information. It's public. It's in the public domain. All right, so we can also, again, track these sources of spending from the circular flow diagram. So in later chapters, when we talk about the GDP, we're going to be talking about the fact that we're looking at the measure of output that is equal to aggregate spending. So we're not always going to consider the three different forms of measuring GDP, but you need to understand that you can measure them in these different ways and they are equivalent. But later on, as we look at GDP throughout the course, we will be thinking about GDP as aggregate spending. So the combination of consumer spending, investment spending, government spending, and the difference between exports minus imports. So again, we're going to have consumption spending, and we're going to usually just use the letter C to represent consumption spending. We're going to have investment spending, and again, we're going to have the letter I represent investment spending. We're going to have government spending included in that, which will obviously use the letter G to represent the government purchases of goods and services. The letter X will represent the sale to foreigners of goods and services. So exports, goods that we export to the rest of the world that they buy from us. We're going to represent that as X. And then the imports are represented by IM. So those are the goods and services that we buy from the rest of the world. So we pay them for those. So that's money that comes out of our aggregate spending. And so therefore the GDP that we'll consider beyond this chapter will be equal to the sum of consumption plus investment plus government spending plus exports minus imports. So this equation you'll see a lot throughout the semester. So get very intimate with it. All right, so the final way to calculate GDP is to measure it as the factor income earned from firms in the economy. So it's adding up all the income earned by factors of production from firms in the economy. So the income, again, can be in the form of wages, interest payment, rent, or profit. So in this case, the wages earned by labor are here: $2,000 from American Ore, $3,700 from American Steel, and $10,000 from American Motor Inc. And we've got and that's going to be equal to $15,700. The interest paid to those who lend their savings to firms and the government, those interest payments are going to total, in this case, $2,600. And the rent by those who lease their land or structures to firms, the amount earned in this case is going to be $1,000. And then, of course, profits that are made by the firm are paid out in the form of dividends. So if you own stock and the firm has profits, they're going to pay out to their stock owners. They pay it out in what's called dividends. And so that's what this last line represents, the amount of dividends that are paid out as profit. So you've got $2,200 there. So if we sum 15,700, 2,600, 1,000, and 2,200, then we are going to wind up with, surprise, 21,500, the value of final goods and services produced in the economy, the GDP. In this case, only one car is produced, so the factor incomes equals the value of final goods and services, which equals the total amount of spending on final goods and services. All right. Hopefully I've driven home these three concepts, these three different ways of measuring GDP. I've covered them enough that you may not have it perfectly, but you have an idea of why it's important in this class, and hopefully you will be focusing on it quite a bit to make the rest of the semester comfortable for you, as far as like your understanding of what we're talking about and why the things we're talking about matter. All right, so as far as the actual components of GDP and what's actually measured, so the height of each bar above the horizontal axis represents the GDP of the U.S. economy in 2013, which was $16.8 billion. So the value added approach is here. So again, it is the difference between the final goods and services produced and the intermediate goods that are used to produce them. And I'm sorry, it's the value of the revenue gained by firms minus the value of the intermediate goods that they buy. And so we've got value added by businesses, value added by households, value added by government. Obviously, businesses make up the majority of the of this kind of approach, and households and government are a small part of that. So that's one way of measuring GDP. We can look at, of course, the spending method. And here we're going to see a slight discrepancy. We see that this bar is slightly lower than that bar. Now, the reason for that is because of accounting reasons. Like, it's not a precise thing to try to account for everything in a way that's going to actually make them equate, because you've got all sorts of sources of different revenue and income streams flowing throughout the economy. Accuracy is an issue, of course. There's human error involved. So, I mean, you're never going to get that precise sort of equivalency, but in theory, ideally, they should equate, and they must equate if you actually were to be able to accurately measure all of them. So anyway, as far as like the spending method goes, we see that consumer spending makes up a hell of a lot of the overall spending in the economy. So consumer spending is nearly 70% of aggregate spending in the economy. Investment spending is only about 16%. We have the government spending on goods and services to be equal to roughly 19%. And then, of course, because we have what's called a trade deficit in the U.S., meaning that we buy more goods and services from the rest of the world than they buy from us. So we import more than we export. Then that actually tends to eat into our overall aggregate spending because it's negative. So we subtract that. So the total length of the right bar is longer than the total length of the left bar, a difference of 497 billion, which is the amount by which the right bar extends below the horizontal axis. So the siphoning of the money to the rest of the world does account for the difference in the heights, but as far as the equivalency goes, the accuracy is where we fall short in terms of actually being able to equate the numbers. So again, we're talking about net exports here, the difference between the value of exports and the value of imports. In 2013, the United States was a net importer of foreign goods and services. Now, who created the national accounts and why? Well, the national accounts owe their creation to the Great Depression. So again, the Great Depression is basically the era that created macroeconomics. It created the need for this discipline. As we learned in Chapter 6, before the Great Depression, we sort of had this attitude of like, let the economy be self-correcting. Let it kind of just do its own thing. It'll eventually, get back to even footing. And so if we have a lot of unemployment, the economy will eventually fix itself. But we saw that we had an extended period of time of having the economy depressed, of having a lot of people unemployed. And so that is what drove economists to start to take seriously some of the ideas that kind of existed already, but were solidified by John Maynard Keynes, this British economist, who wrote the theory of interest and money, and then he sort of like influenced the entire discipline to be able to inform policy to the extent that all sorts of new policies were developed, including the creation of the national accounts. So before this time period, the data was scattered. We had some data on different industries like railroad data, but our ability to collect data was difficult to sort of streamline. Then we had this guy named Simon Kuznets, who's also like this prominent economist who helped to sort of shape the discipline and advance it in ways that economists had not done so before. He was a young Russian-born economist. He developed a set of national income accounts. The first version was presented to Congress in 1937. So the push to complete the national accounts came during World War II, when policymakers were in even more need of comprehensive measures of the economy's performance. The federal government began issuing estimates of gross domestic product and gross national product in 1942. Gross national product is sort of a slightly different way of measuring output. I'm not going to get into it because we don't use the measure anymore. But if you're interested, you can look it up in the book. It explains it. All right. Let's do a quick practice short answer, and then we'll take a break. Explain why the three methods of calculating GDP produce the same estimate of GDP. So again, I'm going through this one more time for you because it's super important that you understand it. So again, GDP, the total value of all final goods and services produced in the economy during a given year. Final goods and services are the goods and services sold to the final or end user. Intermediate goods and services are goods and services bought from one firm by another firm that are inputs for production of final goods and services. Value added is the value of a firm's final sales minus the value of its purchases of intermediate goods and services. And aggregate spending is the sum of consumer spending, investment spending, government spending on goods and services, and exports minus imports, the total spending on domestically produced final goods and services. And investment spending is spending on productive physical capital such as machinery and construction of buildings and on changes to inventories. So the first method of measuring GDP is to add up the total value of final goods and services produced. The second method is to add up the spending on all domestically produced final goods and services. And the third method is to add up total factor income earned by households from firms in the economy. So as far as equating the first two methods, all domestically produced final goods and services are either purchased by somebody or added to their inventories. And so that equates methods 1 and 2. And then all spending that is channeled to firms is used to pay for purchases on final goods and services is revenue for firms. And those revenues must be paid out by firms to their factors of production in the form of wages, profits, interest, and rent. And so that equates the second method with the third method. Quick multiple choice, then we'll take a break. Changes to GDP. Suppose that Mr. Green sells $5,000 of wheat to Big Ben Bakery. Big Ben uses the wheat to make flour and then hamburger buns, which it sells to Hamburger Heaven for $11,000. Hamburger Heaven also buys $20,000 of beef from a rancher. Hamburger Heaven uses the beef and buns to make 10,000 burgers, which are sold for $5 each. How much do these transactions add to GDP? Well, that's the question. So you've got 4 different options here. We've got 36,000, we've got 31,000, we've got 50,000, we've got 86,000. So let's just account for everything. I'm not going to expect you to go through this in your head. Let's go through it just really quickly. Once again, just to kind of solidify some of these concepts. So we've got the sales of what's being produced. We've got intermediate goods, and then we've got value added. So we have Mr. Green. He sells $5,000 of wheat to Big Ben Bakery. And so his sales are $5,000. Did he buy any intermediate goods? No, right? So what is his value added? His value added is $5,000. Right. Then we've got Big Ben. Uses the wheat to make flour and then hamburger buns, which it sells to Hamburger Heaven for $11,000. So what is his value added? It's $6,000, right? He sells $11,000 worth of the buns. He had to pay $5,000 to Mr. Green for the wheat, and thus his value added is $6,000. Did the rancher buy any intermediate goods? That wasn't mentioned, right? So the rancher just sold $20,000 to the Hamburger Heaven in the form of meat. So what is the value added of the rancher? It's $20,000, right? We're not subtracting any intermediate goods there. And then finally, Hamburger Heaven sells 10,000 burgers for $5, right? So that's what? 50 grand, right? How much did Hamburger Heaven spend on intermediate goods? So we had the $20,000 for the beef, and then $11,000 for the buns, right? So 11,000 plus 20,000. So what is the value added of Hamburger Heaven? 19 grand, right? So if we add up, then 5,000 plus 6,000 plus 20,000 plus 19,000, we are going to wind up with our 50,000, which you could have just gotten as the value of the final goods and services sold, which are the burgers, right? Right. But this is the value added approach, and it also allows us to get to the same number, and also allowed us the logic that we need to understand why we don't count these other sales as well. If you understand everything we've been doing because you've been paying attention today, then of course you could have just gotten it that way. But the point is to understand the value added approach, because if maybe it's been a couple of weeks since you've seen this, you might have accounted for some of these other things in the value of final goods and services, and that might have been a problem. Anyway, $50,000 is the answer, and we are going to take a break. Let's come back at 8:35, and we will continue on with this chapter, and we'll begin on the next chapter.